Celebrations now, come on. Why am I so happy? Why could I be so happy? Well, I'll tell you why. It's because my book, The Gallipoli Evacuation, is now available to buy. Hooray! Forget all that and pre-ordering, forget all that. You can actually buy it. You can buy it all over the world through the wonders of the internet. You can pay in a wide range of currencies, and all you have to do is go to our website, which is livinghistoryytv.com. livinghistoryytv.com. You know it makes sense. Buy today.
A Living History production.
I'm Peter Hart, and for the last 40 years I've interviewed thousands of veterans about their experience of war. Join me on a journey through the pages of history. Welcome to Peter Hart's Military History. Hello, and welcome to Peter Hart's Military History Podcast. I'm Peter Hart, I'm lovely, as you know, and with me I have Gary Bain. Now, Gary, what are we doing today? Come on, tell them, tell everyone, tell them now, Gary, tell them.
Well, I suggested, Peter, we might want to do something for our American friends. We have quite a lot of followers in America, and you said, bugger that. But I managed to persuade you, and we're going to be doing the Americans on the Meuse Argonne front in 1918.
I think, joking aside, and I am the author of a book called A Very British Victory, which was a sort of mistake of... As you learn about the Great War and get to a more mature consideration of it, if you like, and the word mature and heart are not often mentioned together, I think you come to see that everybody plays their role. It's not just the British, it's not just the Americans. But there's a lot of rubbish talked by the British about the American contribution. For instance, people say they're Johnny-come-latelys, they get into the war late. Well, just to put it in context, Gary, they joined the war in April 1917, and they're fully in it by, say, July, high summer of 1918. We joined the war in August 1914, and we don't really get involved against the main enemy on the main front until the 1st of July, which is the best part of 2 years. So when we criticise the Americans for being late, imagine what the French think of us.
They think we're lovely.
Yes, and I think the Americans are lovely. So the Meuse Argonne front, that's what we're going to do. We better sketch in how we get there first. So let's look at it. So, how big was the American army when they came in? Are they like Germany with millions under the colours, or the French, or are they more like the British?
No, in fact, they're smaller than British. I think they had a regular army in April 1917 of around about 25,000 men.
That's not many.
It's not, and when you consider that they'd spent the previous year, 1916, 10,000 of them chasing Pancho Villa all the way around Mexico, it's a very, very, very small force.
So they've got the British, they'd gone from, say 250,000 in 1914. They'd expanded to millions. How quickly can the Americans do it? That's going to be the question. Now, the millions flock to the colours, but there's problems. What sort of problems? Now, you were a logistics expert, a commercial logistics expert, the highest order. People even today whisper your name in awe in the highest circles of Transport for London and other such organisations. So what are the problems when you suddenly get 1 million people arrive to join the army?
I don't know.
That's why they whisper your name.
I
think it's in case you come back.
There's some obvious ones. I mean, just simple stuff. Uniforms. Having enough uniforms for the men that were, as you rightly put it, flocking to the colours. So Feeding them.
They need millions of uniforms, would they?
They'd probably need more than 25,000, wouldn't they?
Yeah.
You've got to feed them. Weapons. They're not geared up for a modern war. Munitions, serious problem. And America at that stage couldn't supply it all themselves. And you've got to say that the French and the British, having been engaged for the best part of 4 years at that point, they didn't really have a lot of spare capacity either.
Yeah, because some of the weapons, things like tanks, aircraft, heavy artillery, they're not easy to suddenly... You can't just say, right, that bicycle factory there, it can build a tank next week. It's not that quick, is it? So they are going to be reliant on the Allies to some extent.
And you've also, Pete, you very often talk about good staff work. You've got a lack of experienced military personnel, not only at the staff level, but right the way down to the junior NCO level. Had a real problem.
So just to every army function, there's not enough of. There's not enough officers, not enough NCOs, even down to people drilling. Somebody has to know the drill commands before they can drill you.
Yes. That's where I came unstuck.
Yes. I'm sure. So how could the Allies help? So you've got the British and the French. How could they help? Is there any sort of difference of vision between how the British, say, High Command, the French High Command, and the Americans, how they saw the future? How can they help?
Well, it's fair to say that both the French and the British saw that this sort of unending supply of manpower that would come in and just basically be fed into their armies so that it would be subordinate to the French and the British generals.
They'd be part of the subordinated...
Oh, your knobs just fell off.
It's a bit of... Oh, I'll put it back. If you hear a rustling, that's my knob going back on. Right, fluffy knobs are very difficult to keep on. So it is difficult. They're salivating at the thought of all those troops, but they wanted them feeding into their existing system. The Americans keen on that idea?
No, not really. I mean, could you imagine any politician that supported that would have had a very, very short tenure of office?
And what about and whatever American generals there were, they weren't going to put up with it either. They got to the peak of their command, almost a brigadier, for instance, and then suddenly it's all taken away from there. So there is a compromise, and that is the British kindly offer to incorporate American battalions into their formations. And this is like the British approach to the Indian Army. So they'd have one British battalion and then three Indian battalions, and that then they create their own brigades, divisions, and corps gradually. So that's going on. But the Americans are firm; they reject it completely, and though they will accept British and French help for through various sort of problematical aspects of creating an army. The technical things, they wanted their own army fighting as an independent body on their own designated sector of the Western Front. And nothing else is going to do. They are firm in this, aren't they? And they appoint, as a general, in May 1917, someone who is very keen on this. Not one of my favourites, but you perhaps would fill in some of his background. General John Pershing, known as Black Jack.
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned earlier that in 1916, he was a brigadier general at the time. Pershing launched a punitive raid into Mexico to capture or kill Pancho Villa, who was a sort of bandit come Robin Hood figure, who he was a rival to the Mexican president Carranza. And there'd been some unfortunate incidents culminating in the murder of some American citizens. So a force, as I mentioned, of up to 10,000 American troops went into Mexico and spent pretty much 11 months chasing Pancho Villa all around the country and never captured him.
So not a good start. And it's interesting to note that rank, Brigadier Pershing, and now General Pershing 2 years later. Do you think they were ready? Do you think the American generals, the high command such as it was, do you think they were ready for it? Or do you think that, because they could watch what was happening on the Western Front, couldn't they? They could see what's happening on the Western Front. Did they learn from that? Were they, or did they fall prey to the same misconceptions?
No, I mean, they very much had the same sort of view as both the French and British in probably 1914, that they had this overbearing confidence in the skill and tenacity of the American soldier.
Oh, the old one doughboy is worth 4 Germans sort of thing.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I mean, they were referred to as doughboys, which nobody really knows where that term came from. And that lasted right the way through to the 1940s. But they were seen almost as superhuman, these big, muscly over 6 foot tall.
All of them?
All of them, almost Australian.
That big?
That big.
And that, ladies and gentlemen, is very big.
Pershing particularly envisaged divisions of a much bigger size than the accepted norm in Europe in 1918. And he wanted a crushing firepower with the ability to withstand heavy casualties. So they'd lost
From within the same division.
from within the same division. So he'd learnt nothing. They looked at their own prowess, and that they could take whatever the Germans threw at them, come through it, and then they would march on to victory. Yeah. And it was not going to be that way.
An American division was 28,000 men. A British division, it's 12 battalions of infantry plus 3 machine gun battalions and a battalion of engineers. That's madness. 28,000 men. The average British division in 1918 is more like 12,000, and that's a guesstimate, by the way, because like with the Lewis gun,
40-something.
47. So they've got these great camps in America. They're churning out semi-trained soldiers. They've got no practical experience. And they send their first division across the Western Front. It's a really fast. It's a bit like the British sent 3 or 4 divisions out really early, and they sent out the first division across in May 1917, a month later. What was it called, Gary?
The Big Red One.
We're not even going to make any jokes about that, are we, Gary? We're going to respect their choice of name.
Yes.
Idiots. The Big Red One. What are they talking about, Gary? Anyway, there we go. So the trouble is, they've sent that first one, but by March 1918, they only had 4 American divisions on the Western Front. Pershing had to call on the British and French to help with essential basic training. This is partly because they just had no experience of trench warfare. So things like rifle grenades, they're not Springfield rifles, are they? These are highly complicated things. You need to know how to use them. And so the American units were attached to British divisions for training. Now, here's a quote from Captain Henry Maslin of the 1st 105th. Gives you a clue, the numbers, by the way, of the size of the American forces. 1st 105th Regiment, 27th Division, AEF. And he said, American Expeditionary Force. What does he say, Gary?
I'm told that the Boston accent is very similar to the English accent, so I shall read this in a Boston accent. Our British instructor said, "I want to look your company over at close range as it marches by." As the company passed, he inspected them closely, and tears filled his eyes. He said, "My God, this is Kitchener's army over again. We have nothing like this now. We have nothing left but boys." Well-trained
boys, though, fighting to the all-arms battle system by 1918, late 1918. So that's worth pointing out. There was friction. Why do you think there might have been friction between the American doughboys and the British instructors? What British trait might annoy the Americans?
Well, there was a lack of tact, wasn't there? I think overall British soldiers forgot that they'd once been raw themselves and ignorant of the harsh truths of war. So they just, the message was probably the right one, but delivered in a really pompous way. And so some of the messaging got lost because the Americans obviously just heard the pomposity.
Now, the Americans are definitely on the way then. They're started to, the divisions are coming. The Americans had worked out they'd be there by the high summer, and therefore that one of the reasons for the spring offensives that the Germans launched was that the Americans were coming. They had to win the war in spring 1918.
Yeah, it's worth pointing out that amongst the many shortages that they had a lack of shipping, transport ships to get them there. So, they pressed passenger liners into service, for example, and they seized German ships as well that were in American ports in order to get their troops to Europe.
Well, it's moving millions, isn't it? It's not something you can just do. You can't click your fingers and have it done. That's a great point, Gary. Now, would the Americans be in time? The German offensives are raging. Well, the Americans gradually increased the pace of their contribution, and this reminds me a lot of the British Army in 1914, because they're slowly, so they're involved in the defensive battle at Chateau Thierry late May, and then they demonstrate sort of courage and naivety, tactical naivety at Belleau Wood. You never hear the end of Belleau Wood. In fact, they bang on about these early battles as if they were deciding the whole course of the Western Front.
Oh, hang on. British, Mons, Le Cateau. It's a similar thing with the British. They're hardly massive battles that change the direction of the war.
Not compared to the Battle of the Frontiers and 1,000 French dead in a day.
No,
the day before.
But the same thing applies with Belleau Wood. It's an early engagement, and understandably, the Americans want to make a big thing of it, as we did Mons.
Absolutely. So I stand corrected and chastened. Chastened.
I shall chasten you around the room later.
Gasp. That's a terrible joke. It's just awful. So then the Second Battle of the Marne, they fight alongside the French then. More and more American divisions completing their training. And finally they create the American First Army. Pershing assuming the command of it. My knob's fallen off again. Oh, there it goes, back on. I said they never fell off, but they do, don't they?
They do.
So the American First Army, and it makes its debut as a fighting formation at the Battle of Saint-Mihiel on the 12th of September 1918. Now, this is a bit of a story, because they're fighting, they're trying to pinch out a salient, and they launched the offensive, in fact, just as the Germans are abandoning that salient anyway. But it is a great practice run-through of what you need for a major offensive. And, of course, every level of command, they don't know used to it. So they need to plan it. They need staff officers to work it through. They need to, how do you do a bombardment? How do you integrate your air forces? How do you do this? How do you do that? How do you do that bloody other? So it is an important thing. They get a lot of help from the French with a barrage, and they go over the top. Fine style, and the Germans retreat. Perhaps they're right, Gary. Perhaps war is easy. Perhaps the American one soldier is worth 4 Germans. Or do you think they're going to get a bit of a surprise coming up?
I think that Foch may have a surprise in store for them.
Now, Foch is the supreme commander by this stage on the Western Front, in command of all of the French, overall commander of the French, British, Belgian and American forces. And in a sense, he exacts a high price from Pershing, and the Americans insist on having their own field, their own front, and fighting as a single unit. So what does he give them? What does he give them, Gary? Lovable old Foch. He wouldn't do anything horrible to them, would he?
Yes, he asked them to attack alongside the French Fourth Army under General Henry Durand in the Meuse Argonne area on the 26th of September, which is, frankly, unenviable, I think is a polite way of putting it. It's a hard task. The battlefield's in a shallow valley. It's got rolling ridges dotted around. We've been there. The woods are dense, to say the least. You've got small streams running about, and it's all bounded by a deep river, the Meuse River, which is on the right, I think, which in turn's backed by heights. You know, there's high ground. The heights of the Meuse provided a vantage point for flanking fire from the east side. So really, really tough.
And were the Germans unprepared in this area? Were they sort of caught by this upcoming offensive?
No, I mean, they'd been there since 1914, so they'd had plenty of time to prepare, hadn't they?
This reminds me of the Somme. What have they done then?
Well, they put in a series of barbed wire traps. They've got their trenches carefully sited, the concrete bunkers that, you know, the Germans on the Somme were famous for, machine gun posts and plenty of artillery positions, which, you know, were hidden from sight. And they had, you know, you mentioned my logistics back then, they had a really efficient railway system, which meant that they could get rapid reinforcements in the event that there was any sort of serious Allied assault, and they could get up to 6 divisions there within 48 hours.
And a lot more shortly after, I bet. Now, so what are the trench systems? Well, there's 3. There's the, I can't pronounce it, Gisela-Stellung line. That's either side of a big hill, Mount Faucon Hill, which is in the centre of the valley. Now, we've been there. It's quite it's a real standout thing, Mount Faucon Hill. It dominates the area. But 10 miles behind that, there's a Kriemhilde Stellung, and that goes from Grand Pré, if you've got a map, through Romaine to Briel-sur-Meuse. I bet that's a town on the Meuse River.
Yeah, probably.
Yeah. And 5 miles back further from that is the Freya Stellung. That's not all finished, but basically it's heavy-duty fortifications. And they're covering something important to an old railway hand like yourself. What is it?
I have no idea, Peter.
Absolute bastard. They're covering the Sedan-Mézières Railway. Now, this is a big railway junction.
Couldn't say that.
There's a big railway junction which if you get that, it prevents. It's a bit like Hazebrook or Amiens. It's crucial to the German railway system and would leave the German armies to the north pretty well cut off. Now, Foch, good old Foch, he requires Pershing to take the Kriemhilde Stellung, that's the second line, within 2 days. Not much he's asking for there, Gary. What could go wrong? And then they were going to push on from there, and alongside them, Gouraud's Fourth Army. Now, there are logistical difficulties here. Now, you're the logistics episode. There's no hard words to pronounce. What are the logistical problems they've got?
Well, you've got about 600,000 men, is the first point there. 50 to 60 miles from the St. Michael's salient area. They've got to relieve...
So they've got to go from where they were in St. Michael's salient.
And they've got to relieve some, I think, 200,000 men of the French Second Army in the Meuse-Argonne area.
Ooh, hang on, that First Army's a lot bigger than the French Army, isn't it?
Yeah, it's much, much bigger. In fact, Peter, with my genius of mathematics, it's 3 times the size.
It just shows you, doesn't it?
Education. So it's all across a really poorly ill-served area for roads and railways. I mean, they're basically non-existent. And you've got to share it with the French units as well. So as an added complication, you've got to do it all at night because you want to obviously preserve the element of surprise. And unsurprisingly, staff movement plans, you know, your favourite area about staff work, it basically faltered in the face of what the realities were. It's all very well making your plans on paper, but once you see the ground, things go wrong.
At least it's September, so the weather will be nice.
Yeah, and then it pissed down.
Oh. Have you ever thought Gott mit uns? That's what they wear on the German belt buckle, Gott mit uns. It's a good investment. So the First Army, the American First Army would attack on a 24-mile front, going from the west-hand side of the Argonne Forest right across, and then from the Argonne Forest across the Meuse plain to the Meuse River. To the left of them, or that would be the north, was the French Fourth Army, which they would be supported by a barrage of 4,000 guns, a lot of whom would be French, by the way. That's interesting. Both in the guns and also actual French batteries. They were helping. Pershing knew that the Germans would reinforce quickly, so he planned to do the 10 miles to the Kriemhilde Stellung, that's that second line, his objective, in the first day. And that is even quicker than Foch demanded, and it is ambitious in the extreme, especially with the Mont Faucon Hill in the middle, in the first line, which had to be taken before you could get to the second line. And that Mont Faucon Hill is a big bastard, isn't it? You remember standing on it?
Yeah, we've been there, and it's the site of the Meuse-Argonne American Memorial. It's a very tall, sort of like the marking for the Fire of London, and you go up, it's got about 250 steps inside. Did you get up it? I got up it. Did you get up it?
Yeah, of course I did.
I got up the top and then had to stand very close to the wall because I was suffering from a fear of heights at the time. But
I presume your friends were sympathetic to that.
Oh, yeah, obviously. But it's very imposing, and it gets quite a few American visitors as well. We did little stands there, and you were trying to gather your friends to come around. And I believe you shouted out, "Oi, wanker, come here," which surprised
that was
a number.
Colonel David Barron, if I remember rightly.
It did surprise a number of the American visitors.
Yes, and I apologise unreservedly to them. I must remember my language at times. There's another problem that Pershing's got, is that he used some of his best divisions in the Saint-Mihiel assault. So the Meuse-Argonne assault's going to be with new divisions. They're all new divisions in one sense, but less experienced. Did his plan have subtlety? Was it sort of different plans for different parts of this 24-mile front, or was it just a one-size-fits-all, over the top at 5:30 on the 26th of September? Just do what you have to do.
Yeah. Overcome whatever got in the way, I think, was the attitude, which again is very, very similar to the early attitudes of the French and British in the war.
So no subtlety,
None
brute
at all.
force and ignorance.
Just hit it.
And it should be remembered that Foch, the evil Foch, as I think we'll call him today, this is a part of 4 battles in 4 days. So this was the first attack, and then there'd be a second attack up to 3 more attacks by the British and the French further north. It's 4 days of continuous fighting, trying to stretch the Germans here, there, and everywhere. It's a brilliant conception.
And if anybody wants to read about 4 battles, there's a aptly named book by a certain Peter Hart called The Last Battle.
I'm glad you remember the name. I've got a history of forgetting.
I nearly called it the 4 battles, so I got away with that.
Right, so Pershing is going to drive them on. Now, the Argonne Forest. Let's look at the left of the American attack, the Argonne Forest. Now, we've been there. What was he like, Gary? What do you remember of it? Lovely flat piece of ground, was it, the Argonne Forest?
Well, I'd described it as almost mountainous. It's about 6 miles wide, 22 miles long.
So they'd have to ride through it for 22 miles.
It's totally impenetrable by tanks until the Second World War, anyway. And it's absolutely ideal for defence. It's got high, jagged ridges, deep ravines, swamplands. And, you've got the tangled undergrowth and the woods.
So the woods hadn't been blasted away. It still is a wood.
It's still a wood, and, nature can be quite difficult at times, but you can use it to your advantage. So you've got concealed trenches, for example, in the woods, concrete machine gun posts and barbed wire.
And the barbed wire is often, this is a point about barbed wire, it's not just to stop barbed wire between me and you, to stop me getting at you, which is natural. But there's also the fact is that barbed wire is used to say, oh, you can't go this way.
It funnels you into a direction.
You that way. And when you go that way, the easy way, you're shot to bits by machine guns. It's dreadful. So I presume they had a really experienced, low-numbered division, in the top to attack this.
Yes, the 77th Division.
Oh. Major General Robert Alexander commanding. Any experience of command of a division? Of course not.
No. And they were moving pretty much straight through the forest.
And you've got a couple of accounts from Captain Walter Rainsford. Take us through what happened to Walter.
The upper air grew alive with whistling sounds. On the high ground in front, the shock of explosions merged into one deep concussion that rocked the walls of the dugouts. The night was thick with mist and bitterly cold, a pale thread of moon gliding and disappearing amidst the moving vapour, the lurid glare flickering up and down along the front. As the night dragged on, the mist thickened, wrapping the world in its blind, cold blanket and blotting out the last stark tree stump ahead.
Oh, that was so beautiful.
It was, until I got to that bit, wasn't it? Well, as you mentioned, at 05:50, 10 to 6 in the morning, they go over the top. This is their moment. This is it. And almost immediately, Rainsford was lost. He says, as morning began to lighten, I found myself adrift in a blind world of whiteness and noise, groping over something like the surface of the moon. One literally could not see 2 yards, and everywhere the ground rose into bare pinnacles and ridges, or descended into bottomless chasms, half filled with rusted tangles of wire.
There's a mist, isn't there? There's a really big ground mist. That's what's happening.
Deep, half-ruined trenches appeared without system or sequence, usually impossible of crossing, bare splintered trees, occasional derelict skeletons of men, thickets of gorse, and everywhere the piles of rusted wire. Now, they did make some progress, but by nightfall it was full of confused and separated units, and Rainsford sums it up perfectly as he was trying to find his way back to battalion headquarters. It was black night, and my guide confided the news that, though he knew where battalion headquarters was, he didn't know how to get there. It reminded me of the lost Indian who said, "Indian not lost, Indian here. Wigwam lost." Only now it seemed probable that both the wigwam and the Indian were lost, together with most of the tribe.
Well, I'm not sure about the political correctness of that quote, but I think it gives you the idea. So it was dark, then it was foggy, and they were in a forest. They didn't know where they were, did they? So bad communications, always is bad communication, dreadful visibility. The gunners wouldn't know where they are, which means that there's lots of problems. This is just a nightmare, isn't it? They don't get very... They make some progress, but they don't get very far. So what happens on the rest of the line? I'll sum this up quickly. Next to them, the 28th Division make a bit of progress, but they grind to a halt. Next to them, 35th Division, they've got a lot of tanks with them, and a certain Colonel George Patton, who, by the way, murders someone. If you want to read more about that, I don't like George Patton. If you want to read more about Patton murdering somebody, then read his own account, which is in my book. Dreadful bloke. They don't get very far. There is better results further to the right. Near the Meuse, the 3rd Corps make fantastic progress, smashing through the outer line and make an advance of up to 4 miles. But how do they do in the middle with Montfaucon Hill? Here, 5th Corps under General George Cameron, they stumble to an embarrassing halt. They just don't take it. They got the 79th Division attacking, and they'd only just got to France in early August 1918. Now we talked before, and they're all
only just in France, aren't they? With the exception of the big red one that had been there since May 1917, they're pretty much all raw and recent arrivals.
Inexperienced divisional commanders. That's what's going on here, isn't it? Anyway, they're facing this hill we stood on, and they just getting deadly machine gun, the usual terrible German artillery fire, and what feature do you always get when you're fighting the Germans?
Counterattacks, they're known for it. At this stage, let's remember, this is 1918. This is a battle-hardened German army that they are attacking, and they're in really strong defensive positions. So
failure on the 26th, but on the 27th, do you know they pull themselves together? I think it's fantastic, and they take Montfaucon Hill. I think that's a fantastic achievement by relatively raw troops, don't you? I'm full, but does it help?
I mentioned earlier 48 hours in terms of the German reinforcement. How long have they been attacking Montfaucon Hill at this point?
Well,
it's about 48 hours, isn't it?
And four German divisions had arrived by nightfall on the 26th of September. So that's actually earlier. That's the thing. They'd already arrived by the evening of the first day, and lots more were on the way. Any dreams of taking the second line, the Krimheld-Stellung, are just dreams. And for the next few days, we have to take this in stages. They're just battering their way against, a metaphorical brick wall. And casualties. So we always worry. We're always talking about the British casualties on the Somme. So what are the American casualties in the first few days of the Meuse-Argonne offensive?
Well, I believe that they're over 45,000.
And that's a lot. That must be 15, 16, 17,000 dead. Now, what are the problems? Well, let's do a bit of brainstorming here. The usual stuff. let's examine what we got. I'll go first because I think I'm lovely. I think the whole move was too rushed. Foch had rushed them. They'd been busy in the 12th of September, and then they'd had to rush over to the Meuse Argonne from Saint-Mihiel. The wrong units were sent, and it's just too rushed.
Also, logistics. We mentioned it earlier. Complete nightmare. There was an inadequate infrastructure in the area, and then you combine that with the relative inexperience of the American staff officers, and you've got a perfect storm.
And how long did we take to prepare one of our offensives? And it's not a couple of days, is it?
No, we sometimes take months.
Battlefield communications fail. How might that expose new commanders?
Well, they wouldn't know what was going on other than what was directly impacting their own men.
And they haven't got the experience to cope with unexpected things. I don't think so. They don't really have the right material. So they could have done with more heavy tanks, couldn't they? That would have been nice. Would that have been nice?
It would have been, but what could you do? The Brits certainly had no spare tanks. So it's understandable and unavoidable, I think. You had shortages of pretty much everything because you had a almost unending series of attacks that were scheduled in the north. So you had some light Renault tanks, for example, and they were rapidly eroded within days.
Tanks are almost one-use weapons, aren't they? The light ones are slightly better, but you use a tank, it tends to go out.
And then to top that off, the Germans...
Oh, damn Germans!
They'd moved some 16 divisions. Think about that. 16 divisions to the front.
Now, I'm struggling with that number because I was taught by a chap called Andy. 1, 2, 3 lots.
Yeah, lots.
Lots. I've got you. Lots of German divisions. 28th of September, Pershing temporarily suspends offensive operations, except in the Argonne itself. Now, this is wonderful because, of course, he's on his back. He's got Foch. Do you think Foch is a tolerant and easygoing commander-in-chief?
Yeah.
You're an idiot, Gary. He's a complete swine. He really does give him hell. And there's Haig as well, and they're all basically going, these troops would be so much better if they were in our armies.
No ulterior motive at all, is it?
No.
And of course, Pershing reacts to that by replacing those found wanting and bringing in more experienced divisions. But, frankly, even the experienced divisions are not that experienced. And the 77th Division are still there, still struggling on.
And this is where you have the favourite legend, the American legend of the Great War, is the Lost Battalion.
Yeah, can I point out that they were neither lost nor a battalion? There was about 670 men, I think, in total that found themselves isolated after an attack on the Mont de Charlevaux in the Argonne Forest.
So that's bits of 308th Regiment, mostly 308th, but also a few of 307th, some 306 machine gun. There's a few different sorts there. And you say they're not lost. I think...
Well, they knew exactly where they were because the commander, Whittlesea, had reported them to be there.
Is this Charlie Whittlesea, as I call him?
Major Charles Whittlesea.
Oh, proper respect.
He becomes quite infamous, as I'm sure we'll talk about later. They were lost in the Argonne Forest,
the Ravine de Charlevaux,
and we've been there.
We have, and they were. It's quite dramatic. They're on a very steep hill. Just to see the battlefield now, you've got a road. But that's how we found it. There was a very helpful sign.
There's a sign on the road.
We were careening down there
that says the Lost Battalion with a big arrow pointing.
So we got out and climbed down this ridge. And how steep a ridge? How steep was the valley? The drop down into the valley.
How deep was your valley?
How deep was your valley? It's bloody steep, wasn't it?
It was, and
you could fall down it.
You could fall down it, and it was quite a struggle coming out. You on a number of occasions told me to pull my trousers up.
We're putting a picture of that on.
And on the way up...
No, hang on. That's later. We know, because that's my favourite bit of the story. Let's have the quote first of someone who was there in real life, not in our stupid trip 105 years later. This is Private Arthur Looker of 1st 308th Regiment, 77th...
308th Regiment.
Yeah, gives you a clue, doesn't it? Right, go on. You're a bit of a looker, aren't you?
I am. Private Arthur Looker. Our little plot of ground was not a pretty sight. Graves everywhere, but necessarily so shallow that limbs of our comrades would show through the bit of soil we had been able to scoop over them, and wounded in almost every funk hole. Hunger was gnawing and thirst parching us all, especially those of us who had been gassed during the strenuous drive preceding our present adventure.
Tidy. Now, there were relief operations. They knew roughly where they were, but not enough for artillery, to be precise, and that's part of the story you're going to tell in a moment. The 77th Division just doesn't have the strength to break through, so that the lost battalion would have to fight it out on their own for a bit. And they do. So they're first lost, if you like, on, I think, 2nd of October. And they're there till the 6th of October. And air supply drops, they're quite funny, by American DH-4. It's one of the early supply drops. They fail, don't they? Why do they fail? Why?
Well, to be fair, it's such a small area. It's only about 350 yards long and 50 yards deep. So actually... getting the supplies to where they needed to be. They were more likely to drop supplies to the Germans, frankly.
Yeah, and did. Now, towards the very end, the Germans give a sort of courteously worded invitation to surrender to Whittlesea. And how does he reply, Gary?
Well, it's reported that he gave a rather rude and robust response. But Whittlesea himself... he was known for the rest of his life as "Go to hell, Whittlesea," even. But he denied ever saying it, and he really didn't like the story. But it sounds good, and it's a bit like the Second World War one where he replies "nuts." So it's an apocryphal story. But it's probably not. And
he may have annoyed it because the Germans, whatever he replied, the Germans went mad and launched a massive last attack, which again the lost battalion fight off. And then suddenly it's all over. 1900, evening of 7th of October, they're relieved by the 307th Regiment. But by this time, there was 118 dead and 252 wounded from a total casualty list of 444 for all reasons. That is a hell of a lot. 444 casualties out of, what did you say, 670?
670, yeah.
That's a lot. And I believe, joking aside, I think Whittlesea commits suicide later. Well, he disappears off the back of a boat, as I remember it. I may have to check that. But the end result is a man who couldn't quite live with what had happened to him. Now, so they're relieved. Still the fighting goes on in the Argonne Forest, but back out on the in the Meuse Valley proper. 4th of October, the main offensive bursts back into life. Now, in this area of ground, it reminded us when we were there, didn't it, of the Somme. There's a sort of rolling back, sort of a hill, the ridges stretching across the plain. And here you're going to read a quote, I think, by Lieutenant Maury Maverick. He's a 23-year-old officer of 28th Infantry, 1st Division, the big red one. And as you listen to this quote that, Gary, you're going to read, I think the thing is, this could be anybody from the Battle of the Somme, couldn't it? Anybody. 1st of July, 1916. Is it? No, it's not. It's the Americans in 1918. But listen to it.
Everything happened that never happens in the storybooks of war. We literally lost each other. There were no bugles, no flags, no drums, and as far as we knew, no heroes. The great noise was like great stillness. Everything seemed blotted out. We hardly knew where the Germans were. We were simply in a big black spot with streaks of screaming red and yellow, with roaring giants in the sky, tearing and whirling and roaring. There is a great swishing scream, a smash bang, and it seems to tear everything loose from you. The intensity of it simply enters your heart and brain and tears every nerve to pieces. Although so many men had been killed, there was nothing to do but keep on going.
Now that could be someone on the 1st of July advancing with a 5.9 same gun crashing round them. It's not just machine guns. Does he make it, Gary?
No, he goes on to say, a shell burst above my head. It tore out a piece of my shoulder blade and collarbone and knocked me down. It was a terrific blow, but I was not unconscious. I looked at my 4 runners, and I saw that the 2 in the middle had been cut down to a pile of horrid red guts and blood and meat, while the 2 men on the outside had been cut up somewhat less badly, but no less fatally. It reminded me of nothing I had ever seen before, except a Christmas hog butchering back on the Texas farm.
And this is what I want people to think about. This is Americans suffering, and there's the end bit. That certainly isn't 1st of July and the British. That's their perspective. This is their battle, the Meuse-Argonne battle. And it's just as terrible as the Battle of the Somme was. The British are not the only country to have suffered in the First World War. The French, the Americans, the Belgians, the Germans, the Italians, it's awful.
The Portuguese.
Yes. It's a terrible thing. This story's repeated 1,000 times. And between the 7th and 12th of October, the American First Army is battering their way across to the Krim-held Stellung. Baby steps, isn't it? It's like a toddler's steps, just little tiny steps forward. What does that remind you of? The Battle of the Somme. It's all very... And who's prodding from behind? Pokey.
Well, it would be Foch, wouldn't it? I mean, pretty impatient at the best of times.
And the Americans said they wanted to do it. The Americans said they could do it. So do it. They launch another big assault on the 14th of October. And this time, the 32nd Division under Major General William Hart, they're taking the key strong points of Côte d'Armée and Romaine. This is actually attacking the Krim-held Stellung itself. And they succeed. The objectives, at last, that they were given for the first day, way back on the 26th of September, or first or second day, have been taken. And we've been there. When are we going to talk about the Romaine cemetery?
We'll do that at the end.
At the end, yeah, that'd be better. How do you think the Germans? We said we're going to consider other people. What do you think? Why do you think the Germans are starting to give way? What reason could the Germans have? Whilst the Allies are battering here, there, and everywhere, up and down the Western Front in the 4 battles, you're going to tell us. You're going to be Lieutenant Otto Leys. He was with the Baden Infantry Regiment, 169. And he knows what he's doing. He's an experienced soldier. What does he think?
Weak, decimated infantry companies fought against freshly introduced American battalions and regiments right up to war establishment. Tens fought against hundreds or more. Our few hundreds against thousands from over there. Most of the infantry close support batteries, now reduced to 2 guns, had no horses left. Sweating and straining, the gunners hauled on ropes to drag their guns through the swampy crater field of the wooded valley to positions where they could engage oncoming tanks.
So they're just running. They're running out of everything. They're short of horses. Tanks are referenced. There weren't many tanks then, but the Germans like to mention tanks because it almost gives them an excuse at times. But they are fighting bravely, and they are massively outnumbered at this point. Because, I mean, what makes me almost laugh is that the First American Army is a gigantic military organisation. But what happens on the 16th of October? What happens to frighten the Germans?
Well, the Second American Army comes into existence.
A second American Army? Is that just as big?
Yeah, and it allows for Pershing now to command the resulting American Army group.
Millions.
Millions.
We're talking millions now,
Yeah.
aren't we? So the Americans prepare for their next big assault. You've got the offensive is phasing up and down the Western Front. First the Americans attack, then the British, then the French, then the British and French and Belgians, then the British, and then the Americans. And the next turn is the 1st of November, just before we launch our big attack on the 4th. Poor old Germans, what a hell they're having. Now the Meuse is still in front of them. Now, people say, Why is that? Well, that's because it goes across the battlefront, diagonally across the battlefront. And when you look at a map, you'll see what I mean. But there's no let-up, is there? The Americans are driving on, and Pershing, now the army group leader, is he inclined to rest his men, to give them a chance to recover, perhaps to... The end of the war's clearly coming 1st of November, perhaps less casualties? Or what's his perception?
Well, no, he's thinking is that they've got to seize the moment, no matter what the cost.
Well, this is what Pershing says. Now that Germany and the Central Powers are losing, they are begging for an armistice. Their request is an acknowledgement of weakness and clearly means that the Allies are winning the war. That is the best of our reasons for pushing the war more vigorously at this moment. We must strike harder than ever. Our strong blows are telling, and continuous pressure by us has compelled the enemy to meet us, enabling our Allies to gain on other parts of the line. There can be no conclusion to this war until Germany is brought to her knees. And this is a hard thing. He's taking, I mean, the Allies are playing an equal part. It's not the Americans taking the hard burden and the Allies capitalising elsewhere. That's overstatement. The Americans are playing an enormously valuable role, but so are the French, the British, and the Belgians, the Portuguese. Everybody's playing their part. Now, what do you think the lads in the trenches are thinking as they hear that there's going to be no let-up? What does Private Horace Baker, 3rd 128th Regiment, 32nd Division, what does he say? He's a private. Yeah, he might be a corporal, actually. Sorry, a corporal, I think. Or he gets promoted during the period. Let's leave it at that. So, anyway, his name's Horace Baker. What does he say?
One of the fellows said, yes, if a man had been over here 3 years ago, or even one, and had got killed, it would have been a mercy, for he would have been saved all this suffering. But now it's different. Banholzer added, you're right. I wouldn't mind having been killed away back then, but it would be terrible to get killed the last week of the war, and if I were to get knocked off the last day, why, I'd never get over it. This raised a laugh, of course. And
I used to do this at my literary festivals. That's the kind of person I am, the literary festival type of guy. And they all laugh in the audience, and then you just say, "What did I used to say, Gary?"
Private Albert Banholzer was killed on the 10th of November 1918.
And that is sad. But it happened to so many of them because, driven on by Pershing, there was no let-up. 1st of November, the barrage roars out for the major assault. And this is a description. It's a standard artillery description. Every barrage in the First World War is the greatest barrage ever fired. And this is Corporal Elmer Sherwood of 150th Field Artillery, 42nd Division. Go, Elmer.
At 3 o'clock, our barrage started, and I believe that there has never been such a great artillery demonstration in the world's history. The deafening roar broke forth, not only from our guns, but from thousands, for it had been so wonderfully well timed that the fury was loosed on the dot. Our position is so far forward that a battalion of machine guns operated behind us, and their cracking was so monotonous and intense that actually at times they seemed to drown out the noise of our powerful howitzers. The good old 75s were everywhere. That's the French 75 guns. The Americans really rated the gun, spitting out their destruction. Tongues of flames leapt from the mouths of such numberless guns that the heavens were lighted as by electricity. For a time, Fritz bombarded us, but his burst could hardly be distinguished in the turmoil.
And then at the end of that, then you get the creeping barrages moving forward in front of the American troops. And they sweep through. There's then a farcical incident, which I'm going to describe in just a few words, because it reflects badly on Pershing. Well, perhaps I ought to dwell on it then. Pershing, the French had wanted the honour of entering Sedan, where they'd surrendered in the Franco-Prussian War. A date that's still, by the way, in living memory then. If the Second World War's in living memory now, then that's in living memory then. But Pershing wanted that honour for the Americans, and it's a shocking display of bad manners. He gets he sends his troops across, and there's a row between them. The divisions are crossing each other. The French get mad. The Americans get mad. Everybody gets mad, and it's a disgraceful scene, and eventually the French do get to Sedan and enter it in triumph. They're meanwhile trying to cross. They've got to cross the Meuse River, and they have to keep crossing it. And is it a small and insignificant little stream, Gary?
Yeah, it's about 300 foot wide.
And deep?
Oh, it's very deep.
Oh.
1, 2, 3 deep.
Ah, right, gotcha. 7th of November, 128th Regiment, they'd been attached to 5th Division, and they'd already crossed, but they got caught in some woods, and a good old Corporal Horace Baker is caught up in the action, and you don't need to know where this is. The great thing of this is, what I like about this is he and his section had been up in some woods, and they had to fall back in disorder, and then suddenly an officer comes out, stems the retreat and orders Baker and his men back up the hill. And then he has to make simple life or death choices. And I love the choice he makes because it's so much one sort of soldier. Go on, read the quote, Horace.
I looked down the hill, straining my eyes through the fog. Somehow there was a blur in the little thicket at the far side of the field. I looked again, and horrors, it was a line of German soldiers, not less than 200 strong, standing or walking about. It will be difficult to tell my emotions then. My hair stood on end as it does when I see a snake. I raised my rifle and took deliberate aim. Thinks I can get one now, and know I got him. But just as I was ready to pull the trigger, I thought of something else. I can get 2 at least before they can tell where I am. So I aimed again, but failed to shoot again, for a pesky thought almost knocked me down. It was, what if I do kill 2 or half a dozen, and they swarm over the field and kill me? How much will that profit me? So I decided to let them live.
I think that's just, it's not a very soldierly thing, but it's very human, isn't it, Gary? Do you not empathise with him?
I'd have done exactly the same thing.
Yeah, I think, well, I'm certain I would. I might have run away when I first saw the German soldier, not taken aim at all. Anyway, the swollen Meuse still lies ahead of them a lot of the time on the 10th of November. Because as they move forward, because it runs diagonally across the front, and Pershing keeps ordering assaults across the Meuse, even down to the last time, right up to the 11th of November. And I think a lot of people, the British, after the 4th of November, the big assault on the 4th of November, the Battle of the Sambre, I can't remember, one of those battles, they back off, don't they? And they're sensible. The Americans are not sensible. And this is a wonderful quote, I thought, when I wrote my book. I found it in the oral history by a Sergeant Melvin Krulevich of the 2nd 6th Marines 2nd Division. And he and the Marines are ordered to cross this bloody great big river, and they've just got 2 footbridges, and one of them's falling in almost. And they're both covered by machine guns. And they're approaching the river. And just to set the scene, it's Sergeant Melvin Krulevich's 23rd birthday on the 11th of November, i.e. that day or the next day. And this quote is, I think it's perfect. We'll have a little think about that afterwards. Suddenly there came a new note in the approach of a whiz-bang, and every Marine froze to the spot. I want you to think about the word whiz-bang. Each knew from experience this particular high explosive had his name on it. Fascinated, immobile, they could only await the end. The shell landed squarely in the middle of the company, and in that fraction of a second, between hit and explosion, there was no thought as to past and future. Each soldier braced himself for the terrific impact of the next moment, when the fuse would detonate the charge. Nothing happened. For that little group of men came the war's greatest thrill, and my best birthday present. The fuse was a dud. Now, when I heard that and then transcribed it and put it in my book, The Last Battle, available from all good booksellers, I thought that was great. And then, funnily enough, I was looking him up and I discovered he was an American politician. I think he was a state governor. And then I thought something else. Whiz-bang. Why do they call it a whiz-bang? You can't hear it coming. It's almost instantaneous. Sounds more like a 5.9. But then I thought something else. What do you think I thought, Gary? Well, what do you think when you hear it?
Well, if you're relaying that story later, when you might have embarked on a political career, It's quite useful, isn't it?
It's perfect, isn't it?
It's the perfect quote.
And when oral historians encounter the perfect quote from someone who has a reason for wanting to appear good, I'm now dubious. I would no longer put it in the book, funnily enough. But in a way, I'm glad it's there because everyone can make their own mind up. I am not, by the way, saying he's lying. He was in that unit. He was involved in that action. Something may have happened. I just think the story has been polished.
Yeah. So anybody who bought The Last Battle, if you can go and find that quote and just delete it, black marker will do.
Or tear that page out. Use it for some purpose.
Yeah.
Now, many of them, we know the fighting ended at 11 o'clock. Do you think the lads on the ground really knew that? Or did they think the Germans might continue fighting? Or that they might have got it wrong? Or what did they think, would you think?
Well, they knew it was meant to, but they couldn't possibly know that there wouldn't be local infractions, that it would stop at 11 o'clock. But human nature, they'd have been counting down to 11 o'clock.
A real countdown, wouldn't
Yeah.
it? 10, 9,
Yeah.
8. Now, one man dies in the last minute of the war. Now, people are dying for the next 2 years of the effects of the Great War, wounds and things. But one, Private Henry Gunther of 1st 313th Regiment, 79th Division, he's advancing towards a pair of German machine guns in the village of Chaumont, devant Damvillers. That will be Chaumont in front of Damvillers, I think. My French is bloody awful. Anyway, he ignores explicit orders from his sergeant at 1 minute to 11, and the 23-year-old makes a solo bayonet charge. And this is a strange thing because it's almost humorous, but of course a young boy I don't know what he's doing. Nobody knows why he did it. He'd just been demoted, so perhaps he was trying to get his stripe back. We don't know what was in his mind because the Germans are waving. They're
trying to stop him.
They're trying to stop him, and he's getting closer and closer, and he's got a big rifle and a pointy thing on the end of it. What can the German machine gunners do? Well, I'll tell you what they do. What do you think they do?
They kill him.
Yeah, it's not funny, and he's supposed to be the last American soldier to die in action during the Great War. Lots more would be dying. It's a strange story, and poor old Private Henry Gunther, a typical American with that American-sounding name. It's another irony, Gunther. Where do you think his family come from?
Ireland.
Oh, Gary, you're so difficult in podcasts. Major General William Hart, I've got some quotes from him, I quite like him. This is what he said. He's really old-school American. I'm glad the war is over. This is a day of celebration. We're now waiting for the enemy to get a little start, and then we'll follow him. And before long, we will establish Die Wacht on Rhine. I think that means the watch on the Rhine, but I can't pronounce German. Isn't that grand? Anyway, we lick the throat to a frazzle, and the Hohenzollerns and Habsburgs are out of business for keeps. Well.
Where was Hahn from?
Yes. America. There are some interesting articles about the amount of Germans in the American army, and the Americans are not all British. Anyway. When you analyse the American performance that's the end, of course. That's the end of the Battle of Meuse, Argonne. When you analyse the American performance, what do you think, Gary? What do you think about the way they fought, how they fought?
Yeah, let's just look at this, in the round, as it were. It's not always complimentary, is it? So it's claimed that they deployed too many of their giant divisions, and they were giant divisions, we mentioned that earlier.
28,000 men.
So that it was clogging up a very narrow front, created chaos in the movement of troops, supplies, munitions, and indeed the wounded.
So there's a logistical problem of having such huge divisions
too big.
Cramped in.
Absolutely.
And when you meet Germans fighting who are doing the opposite, they're using the minimum possible troops, aren't they? So they're defending they're using the machines.
Well, and the terrain.
And the terrain.
Yeah.
Now, did the Americans advance well? they certainly seem to start every assault bravely, absolutely. But do they fall apart? What could call them to fall apart? Or is this just well? Let's discuss it.
Well, like any troops, they advance in really good style until they're hit by heavy fire. It's at that point that they tended to flounder. The junior officers and NCOs that were there needed experience to grow into the role, and they didn't have the luxury of the time to do that. Their training wasn't good enough to allow them to perform even simple tactical drills when, let's face it, you're terrified and you're confused and you don't know what's happening around you, and the noise and shock of battle does mean that you have to rely on your training and your drill to be able to cope with it, and they didn't have it. And
that's shock and awe, I think an American commander referred to. It's
yes.
Terrifyingly noisy. It's not noisy like a few bangs. This is mayhem. Do you think they had the technical skills? Soldiering is quite technical, isn't it? It's not just firing a Springfield or Lee Enfield rifle. A lot of them had Lee Enfields. They always refer to Springfields, but a lot of them had Lee Enfields. Do they know how to use the more sophisticated weapons?
Well, no. I mean, like the British at the start in 1914, the rifle was king, and their training relied on them looking after the rifle. The rifle is your best friend. But you had machine guns, grenades, rifle grenades by this point, mortars, and you had to use them to maximum effect, because otherwise you couldn't deal with the strong points that were blocking your way.
Now, there's been accusations that generals made mistakes. The capital of Montfaucon Hill early on, that one of the generals was supposed not to have helped when he could have done. Other generals make mistakes. This is put forward as being something terrible.
Yeah, because we've never made any mistakes, have we?
Well, I'm glad you agree. Generals make mistakes. Of course they make mistakes.
A, they're human, and B, they were as inexperienced as their troops were.
And you don't fight a battle on your own, do you? There's somebody else involved in the battle.
Well, usually the enemy sits back, lets you do what you want, and then, of course, not. The enemy reacts to what you're doing, or indeed prevents you from what you're doing.
So there may have been some mistakes, some chances may have been missed, but with terrible communications, the chaos of war, lack of experience, I think it's fairly understandable. One thing I would criticise is that some of them carry through to the end this idea that the rifle is king. Now, this is Major General Robert Alexander. He commanded the 77th Division, and if anybody should have learned after battering through the Argonne, it's him. But this is a quote from him about the good old-fashioned Springfield rifle. And this, by the way, was in the official the history, the 77th Division history. And this is what he'd learned from fighting there.
I thought I noticed that there was a disinclination to utilise to its full potential power the infantry rifle. Machine guns, hand grenades, 37mm, are useful in their way, but they are merely auxiliaries. An intelligent use of the infantry rifle wins battles when no other instrumentality will suffice.
Now, I'm sure he was an intelligent officer and a good commander, but that is utter and complete bollocks and the absolute reverse of the truth. It is traditionalist thinking. It harks back to the old virtues, and exactly who could be talking there? It could have been who?
Well, it could have been the British in 1914,
or the French in 1914, or the Italians in 1915.
15 rounds per minute.
That'll do them.
That'll do them. But, I mean, it did have a place in modern warfare. You need infantry. Somebody has to take the ground. But the firepower generated and we've talked about it before, the all-arms battle is now necessary to win the war in 1918.
So the rifle is a small part within the all-arms battle. Winning on the battlefield demands that you achieve a firepower superiority. Do you achieve it with a rifle or with an artillery barrage, mortars, gas, tanks, and all the other paraphernalia of war? The answer is that the rifle becomes less and less important.
Well, a rifle wouldn't suppress a German battery, would it? Let's be frank.
And how's a rifle going to take a strong point? You need hand grenades, or you need a barrage, or a tank, or he's just got it wrong. You've got to wear smoke shells. There's lots of things you need. The American army had a lot to learn, not just in fighting, no, in logistics. And boy, do they learn that lesson, because I think one thing is the Americans become masters of logistics over the years since. Now, I think we want to finish by just putting it all in context. So the Americans had problems, but the numbers were supremely important, weren't they? The sheer numbers they were deploying, and they were fighting hard. Now, the French are still crucial on the Western Front. The British are still crucial on the Western Front. The French have slightly run out of steam, haven't they? I think you were talking about this earlier.
Yeah, I mean, it's hardly surprising. They'd borne the brunt of the fighting for pretty much the best part of 3 years. So it's hardly surprising that, they'd had the mutinies. They'd reorganised subsequently, but they really, really, really suffered throughout the preceding years.
So they still fought hard, but they would insist that minimum risks were taken. They were very slow, and they depended a lot on very, very big barrages, more so even than we did. But it was they made a huge overall contribution. They also, you mentioned it earlier, contributed in other ways. I mean, what about French industry? How does that help the Americans? How does that help the Allies?
Well, they supplied 3,500 of the just over 4,000 artillery guns that the Americans used. So I think it was 227 of the 289 tanks and 4,874 of 6,394 aircraft. So logistically, without that support, the American army would not have functioned.
That was an amazing contribution of those very expensive and important weapons.
And that would naturally hinder their own ability to be offensive, because they were supplying material to the Americans.
Now, the British are fighting hard, the French are fighting hard, the Belgians, Portugal, everyone is doing well. But let's turn back now to an assessment of the American contribution on the Meuse Argonne. The sheer size of the American army is a massive threat to the Germans, I think they gained enough experience to become more and more of a threat. By the 1st of November, that offensive on the 1st of November, the barrages, the way they crash in, it's as good as the British and French anyway. They are learning. They've grasped the tactics. In a sense, they were a bit slow to grasp the tactics and not helped by Pershing's obstinacy, but they do grasp the tactics much quicker than our boys do, partly because, of course, it's been learnt for them. But, what's your dominant emotion when you think about the American contribution?
Well, you mentioned it earlier. We visited the area, I think it's a few years ago now, 3 or 4 years ago, and we visited the Meuse Argonne American Cemetery at Roman. And it's an incredibly sobering place. Like a number of these cemeteries, it is immaculately maintained. It's almost beautiful in appearance, but it fully demonstrates the level of sacrifice made by the AEF. There's 14,246 of their war dead buried in that cemetery. It's by far the largest number of any of their cemeteries in Europe.
I think the dominant emotion, I think, for both of us, certainly when we were there, is heartfelt admiration and gratitude, the sheer spirit of these relatively untrained troops, the way they put their lives on the line. Whatever you might say about tactical shortcomings, they're willing fighters. They're really willing. And they do, at high cost, force the Germans back. So the Americans played a crucial part that cannot be forgotten. And the one thing the Americans did was they removed all hope of victory from the Germans. Once the spring offensives had failed and the Americans had arrived on the Western Front, the Germans had no chance whatsoever. The losses were painful, and that cemetery, I remember we were both quite touched as we gazed round.
It's huge, and it contains Medal of Honor winners, but it's got huge New York battalions and rows of Jewish gravestones, for example. And it just brings home to you, how this must have decimated, as indeed the PALS battalions did for the British, whole areas of America. New York, the losses in that cemetery are huge just from that one city.
So we'll finish up on a serious note for once, just by saying thank you to the Americans in the Great War.
Yep.
Thank you,
Pete.
Gary. Cheers.